What if the greatest act of worship in human history began with God letting Satan destroy a righteous man? This is the terrifying reality behind one of the oldest stories ever told, a story not about failure, but about faith. Not about punishment, but permission. In the throne room of heaven, God himself pointed to a man named Job and allowed hell to come for him, not because he was weak, but because he was faithful. What followed became a cosmic drama so intense that even the angels fell silent and the foundations of faith trembled. This is the story of the greatest test of faith the world has ever known. Job's name has become synonymous with suffering, but that misses the point entirely. His story isn't about why bad things happen to good people. It's about what happens when the invisible war between heaven and hell chooses a human battlefield. It's about a man who lost everything and discovered something worth more than all of it combined. In the land of Uz lived a man so righteous that hell trembled at his name and heaven watched his every prayer. Job wasn't just wealthy, he was generous. He wasn't just successful, he was spiritual. In a world where most people served God with their leftovers, Job served him with his first and his best. But Satan had been watching, and he had a theory about human nature that would shake the cosmos.
Nobody really loves God for who he is. They only love what he gives them. Take away the blessings, strip away the comfort, remove the hedge of protection, and watch even the most faithful crumble into cursing.
God's response changed everything.
Very well then. Everything he has is in your power.
What happens when heaven goes silent and the only voice left is the accuser? On one ordinary morning, Job woke up as one of the wealthiest, most blessed men on earth. By sunset, he would become the most famous sufferer in human history. Between sunrise and darkness, his children would die, his wealth would vanish, and his body would become a battlefield of pain. And just when Job thinks his trial has reached its peak, God does something no one expects. You're about to witness the most profound drama ever written, where suffering becomes a stage, where pain transforms into purpose, and where one man's refusal to curse God becomes a testimony that echoes through eternity. The question isn't whether you've heard of Job. The question is, are you ready to see what worship looks like when it costs you everything? Sometimes the silence of heaven is not absence, but a stage set for revelation. Before the storm, there was the man. Job wasn't just wealthy, he was generous. He wasn't just successful, he was spiritual. In a world where most people served God with their leftovers, Job served him with his first and his best. Every morning, before the sun painted the hills of Uz, Job would rise to offer sacrifices for his children. Not because they had sinned, but because they might have sinned. Not out of duty, but out of love. "Perhaps my children have cursed God in their hearts," he would whisper as smoke rose from the altar. This wasn't paranoia. This was the heart of a father who understood that blessing comes with responsibility and privilege comes with spiritual danger. 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, servants beyond counting. But none of that impressed heaven as much as this. Job feared God and turned away from evil. The word fear here doesn't mean terror. It means reverence so deep it shapes every decision. Job didn't just believe in God, he lived as though God was watching, because he knew God was watching. In the ancient world, wealth was seen as proof of divine favor. Job had both, but he wore his blessings like a steward, not an owner. When the poor came to his gate, they didn't leave empty-handed. When the orphan cried for justice, Job's voice thundered in the courts. When the widow needed protection, Job became her shield. He was blameless, not sinless, but complete. Upright, not perfect, but consistent. the kind of man whose very existence made Satan nervous. You see, Job represented something dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. He proved that it was possible to be blessed and still be humble, rich and still be righteous, powerful and still be pure. In a world where most people either served God for what they could get or abandoned him when life got hard, Job loved God simply because God was worth loving. He was an echo of Eden in a fallen world, a preview of the kingdom in a broken age, the kind of man who made angels wonder what Adam might have been and demons tremble at what humanity could become. But Satan had been watching too, and he had a theory. In the unseen realm, Job had become more than a man. He had become a test case. The question wasn't just about Job's faith. It was about the nature of faith itself. Can anyone love God for who he is, or do we all love him for what he gives us? The accuser was about to find out. The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. A vast assembly in the throne room of heaven. Angels arriving from the four corners of creation, each carrying reports of their stewardship. Light beings bowing before the Ancient of Days. The air thick with worship, heavy with holiness. And then, a shadow that doesn't belong. Satan comes also among them, not sneaking, not hiding, walking boldly into the presence of the Almighty as though he has every right to be there. Because in this cosmic courtroom, he does. He is the accuser of the brethren, the prosecutor in the trial of human hearts. Where have you come from? God asks. The question isn't for information, it's for declaration. Satan's answer reveals his nature, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. He is the restless one, the prowler, searching for whom he may devour. But then God does something that changes everything. He brings up Job. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Why would God do this? Why would the Almighty put his most faithful servant in Satan's crosshairs? Satan's response cuts to the heart of every believer's deepest fear. Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. This is the accusation that shakes the cosmos. Nobody really loves God. They only love his gifts. Take away the blessings, and you'll see the truth. Strip away the comfort, and watch the worship disappear. Remove the hedge of protection, and witness faith crumble into cursing. Satan doesn't just test your circumstances, he tests the authenticity of your worship. And then comes the moment that defines the entire book, God's permission. Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. What if your greatest pain is actually God's highest vote of confidence in you? The accuser departs with a license to destroy, but not to kill. The test is set. The stage is prepared. And Job, faithful, generous, worshipping Job, has no idea that his name has just been spoken in the courts of heaven. The war for his soul is about to begin. The morning began like every other morning. Job's children were feasting at the oldest brother's house. The servants were tending the flocks. The oxen were plowing. Life was moving in its familiar, blessed rhythm. And then the first messenger came running, breathless, panicked, covered in dust and terror. "The Sabaeans attacked and carried off the oxen and donkeys," he gasped. "They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." Before Job could process the words, before the shock could settle, another figure appeared on the horizon, running, stumbling, desperate to deliver news that would shatter another piece of the world. The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants. and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. The fire of God. Even in destruction, even in loss, the messenger recognized divine power. This wasn't random. This wasn't accident. This was something else entirely. Job's mind raced. His heart pounded. But the nightmare was only beginning. A third messenger arrived, his clothes torn, his face streaked with tears of horror. The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. 3 messengers, 3 disasters, 3 pieces of a carefully constructed life lying in ruins. But Satan wasn't finished. He had saved the worst for last. The 4th messenger didn't run. He stumbled. He could barely speak through his sobs. When he finally found his voice, the words came out broken, shattered. Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. The silence that followed was deafening. In one day, one terrible cosmic day, Job had lost his wealth, his livelihood, and his children. Everything that made life worth living had been stripped away in 4 conversations, 4 messengers, 4 hammer blows to the soul. The sky hadn't just broken open, it had fallen. Job stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of his world, and then he did something that made heaven weep and hell tremble. He tore his robe, he shaved his head, and then he fell to the ground in worship. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Worship is never more real than when it rises from the ruins. But Satan wasn't finished, not yet. The accuser returned to heaven, furious and frustrated. Job had passed the first test. He had lost everything and still worshipped. He had been stripped of wealth, livelihood, and even his children, yet his lips had spoken praise instead of curses. Satan's theory was cracking, but he wasn't ready to surrender. "Skin for skin," he snarled before the throne. "A man will give all he has for his own life, but now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." The logic was cold and calculating. People can endure the loss of possessions. They can even survive the death of loved ones. But when pain invades their own body, when suffering becomes personal and inescapable, that's when faith finally breaks. God's response was the same: permission with limits. "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." What followed was a masterpiece of misery. Job's body became a battlefield. Painful sores erupted from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. His skin cracked and oozed. His flesh rotted while he was still alive. The man who had once been the most blessed in the East was now unrecognizable, a walking picture of human frailty. He took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself as he sat among the ashes. The ash heap, the place where refuse was burned, where the unwanted was discarded. Job, who had once sat at the city gates dispensing wisdom and justice, now sat at the garbage dump, scraping pus from his wounds. And then his wife appeared. We often paint her as the villain, but imagine her pain. She had lost her children too. She had watched her husband, the man she loved, the father of her dead children, transform from a pillar of strength into a broken figure covered in sores. Her world had collapsed just as completely as his. "Are you still maintaining your integrity?" she asked. The words weren't cruel, they were desperate. "Curse God and die. End the charade. Stop the pretense. If this is what faithfulness gets you, then abandon faith. Choose death over this living hell." Job's response cut through the ashes like a sword. You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Even in pain, especially in pain, Job refused to let suffering rewrite his theology. He wouldn't let circumstances dictate his understanding of God's character. The same hands that had blessed were now allowing affliction, and Job would trust both. In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. But the real test was just beginning. Because sometimes the cruelest trial isn't what God allows. It's what well-meaning friends say in response. News travels fast in the ancient world, especially bad news. When Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. These weren't casual acquaintances. They were old friends, wise men in their own right, respected leaders who had known Job in his prosperity. They had shared meals at his table, laughed at his jokes, sought his counsel in difficult times. They loved him, which makes what happens next so much more tragic. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. The man sitting in the ashes bore no resemblance to the Job they remembered. His face was swollen beyond recognition. His body was covered in running sores. His voice, when he spoke, was barely a whisper. The strongest man they had ever known looked like he was already dead. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven, ancient signs of mourning and shock. And then they did something beautiful, something we rarely talk about in our rush to criticize them. They sat down with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. 7 days of silence, 7 nights of presence, 168 hours of simply being there, sharing his grief without trying to fix it, explain it, or spiritualize it away. For 7 days, they got it right. They understood that sometimes love doesn't speak, it just sits. Picture that scene. 4 men sitting in ashes under the desert sky, the wind whistling through the garbage heap, the sound of Job's labored breathing, the weight of shared sorrow pressing down like a physical thing, the smell of burning refuse mixing with the scent of infected wounds. But in that silence, something profound was happening. 3 men were looking at their friend's destruction and trying to make sense of it. Their minds were working, grinding, searching for explanations. Their theology was churning, desperate to find a formula that could contain this mystery. Why would God allow this? There had to be a reason. There had to be logic. There had to be something Job had done to deserve this, because if there wasn't, if this could happen to someone as righteous as Job, then what did that say about the rest of them? The silence was about to break, and when it did, comfort would turn into condemnation. But when they finally open their mouths, their comfort turns into cruelty. The silence shattered like glass. After 7 days of sitting in the ashes, after 168 hours of watching their friend suffer, Job's friends finally spoke. What came out of their mouths wasn't comfort, it was theology, cold, systematic, merciless theology that cut deeper than any sword Satan had wielded. Eliphaz spoke first, the eldest and most respected. His words sounded spiritual, even wise. Consider now, who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. The logic was simple and brutal. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. Since bad things are happening to you, Job, you must be bad people. The math of suffering reduced to a formula. Bildad picked up the theme, his voice growing harder. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. Your children are dead, Job. because they deserved to die. God doesn't make mistakes. If you're suffering, you've earned it. If your family was destroyed, they had it coming. Zophar delivered the final blow with the confidence of a man who had never truly suffered. Oh, how I wish that God would speak, that he would open his lips against you and disclose to you the secrets of wisdom. Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin. You're getting off easy, Job. God isn't punishing you as much as you deserve. Your suffering isn't evidence of injustice, it's evidence of mercy. 3 men, 3 variations of the same poisonous theme. You deserve this. Have you ever been hurt by someone trying to fix your pain with easy answers? Have you ever had well-meaning people explain your suffering in ways that made it worse? Job's friends represent every person who has ever used theology as a weapon, who has turned the word of God into a sword to wound the already wounded. They weren't malicious, they were terrified. Because if Job could suffer like this without deserving it, then their neat little theological boxes were useless. If righteousness didn't guarantee blessing, if faithfulness didn't ensure protection, then what security did any of them have? So they rewrote the story. They made Job the villain to preserve their view of God as predictable, controllable, transactional, but Job refused to accept their narrative. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face. The real conflict wasn't Job versus his friends. It was Job versus their theology. And sometimes, theology without empathy becomes cruelty in God's name. Something inside Job finally snapped. For chapters, he had maintained his composure. He had worshipped in the ashes. He had refused to curse God. He had defended his integrity against his friends' accusations. But the human heart can only carry so much weight before it buckles under the load. The dam broke, and what poured out was raw, unfiltered anguish. May the day of my birth perish, and the night that said, "A boy is conceived." That day, may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine on it. Job didn't curse God, but he cursed the day God allowed him to be born. He didn't reject his Creator, but he questioned why creation had to include him. The man who had blessed the name of the Lord was now wishing he had never existed to speak that name at all. Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might be nursed? For now I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep and at rest. This is the sound of a soul in free fall. The voice of a man who has discovered that there are depths of pain for which there are no words, only groans too deep for language. Job had found the place where faith and despair crash into each other like tectonic plates, creating earthquakes in the human heart. Why is light given to those in misery, and life to the bitter of soul, to those who long for death that does not come, who search for it more than for hidden treasure? The questions tumbled out like accusations, each one a dagger thrust at the heart of existence itself. Why do the suffering have to stay conscious? Why can't the broken just slip away? Why does life persist when life has become unbearable? But notice what Job didn't do. He didn't curse God. He didn't reject his faith. He didn't embrace his wife's counsel to curse God and die. Instead, he did something that scandalized his friends and revealed the true depth of his relationship with the Almighty. He complained to God about God. This wasn't atheism, it was intimacy. Job's lament wasn't the voice of someone who had stopped believing. It was the cry of someone who believed so deeply that he could bring his darkest thoughts into the light of God's presence. Scripture gives space for holy anguish. The Bible includes Job's collapse not as a warning, but as a comfort, proof that you can wrestle with God and still be wrestling with God. The darkness was about to get darker, but dawn was coming. Just when it seemed the conversation had reached its bitter end, a new voice broke through the tension. Elihu, son of Barakel the Buzite, had been listening in silence. Younger than the others, he had held his tongue out of respect for his elders. But as the debate spiraled into accusations and despair, his anger burned hot, not just at Job's friends, but at Job himself. "I am young in years and you are old. That is why I was timid and afraid to tell you what I know. I thought age should speak, advanced years should teach wisdom, but it is the Spirit in a person, the breath of the Almighty, that gives them understanding." Elihu represented a different generation, a fresh perspective unclouded by the rigid formulas that had trapped the older men. He saw what they had missed. Both Job and his friends were wrong, but for different reasons. To the friends, he said, "You have not answered Job's arguments. You've simply accused him without proof, condemned him without evidence." To Job, he declared, "You have justified yourself rather than God. You have made yourself more righteous than the Almighty." But Elihu's real contribution wasn't his criticism, it was his theology. While the friends had reduced God to a cosmic accountant and Job had begun to see him as absent or indifferent, Elihu painted a picture of a God who speaks in many ways, even through suffering itself. God speaks in one way and in two, though people do not perceive it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on mortals, while they slumber on their beds, then he opens their ears and terrifies them with warnings. Sometimes, Elihu suggested, pain isn't punishment, it's communication. Suffering isn't always about what you've done wrong. Sometimes it's about what God wants to do right in your heart. God delivers the afflicted by their affliction and opens their ear by adversity. This was revolutionary thinking. What if trials weren't evidence of God's absence, but proof of his involvement? What if the very thing that felt like abandonment was actually attention of the most intense kind? Elihu spoke with passion, with conviction, with the fire of someone who believed he had glimpsed something the others had missed. His words hung in the air like thunder, demanding a response. And just as Job prepares to answer, another voice breaks through, not from earth, but from a whirlwind. The debate was about to end, not because anyone had won the argument, but because the one they were arguing about was about to speak for himself. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. No warning, no introduction, no gentle transition from human debate to divine declaration. The voice that spoke the universe into existence suddenly erupted from the storm, and every other voice fell silent. But God didn't come with explanations. He came with questions. "Who is this who darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." The roles reversed in an instant. For 37 chapters, Job and his friends had been questioning God's justice, his wisdom, his character. Now God was questioning them, not their suffering, but their understanding. "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me, if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it?" The questions came like thunder, each one more overwhelming than the last. God didn't defend his actions. He revealed his majesty. He didn't explain the suffering. He exposed the smallness of human perspective. Have you ever given orders to the morning, or shown the dawn its place? Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? This wasn't cruelty, it was perspective. God wasn't belittling Job's pain. He was expanding Job's vision. The same God who commands the morning and knows the dwelling of light was the God who had been present in every moment of Job's agony. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Can you loose the cords of Orion? The poetry was breathtaking, but the point was devastating. If you can't understand how I govern the physical universe, how can you judge how I govern the moral one? Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? There it was, the heart of the matter. In his pain, Job had begun to put God on trial, to demand explanations as though the Creator owed the creature an account of his ways. God's response wasn't angry, it was awesome. He didn't give Job what he thought he wanted, answers, but what he actually needed, encounter. The whirlwind wasn't just weather, it was revelation. The storm wasn't just meteorology, it was theology. And in that moment, Job discovered something that would change everything. Sometimes God doesn't give explanations, he gives revelation. Sometimes the answer to why, it's God himself, revealed in power and majesty and mystery. Job was about to learn that seeing God changes everything. In the face of the whirlwind, Job's words died in his throat. For chapters, he had demanded an audience with God. He had wanted to present his case, to argue his innocence, to get answers for his suffering. He had imagined himself standing before the Almighty as an equal, demanding justice, requiring explanations. But when God actually showed up, Job discovered something that shattered every assumption he had made. You don't argue with God, you encounter him. You don't debate the Almighty, you bow before him. I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. The silence that followed wasn't defeat, it was revelation. Job had spent his entire ordeal trying to make sense of his suffering. Now he realized that suffering had never been about sense. It had been about sight. Then God spoke again from the whirlwind, and his second speech was even more overwhelming than the first. He painted pictures of his power that left Job breathless. Behemoth, the creature of unimaginable strength. Leviathan, the monster no human could tame. Creation in all its wild, untamable glory. The message was clear. If you cannot master the creatures I have made, how can you master the Creator who made them? And then Job spoke the words that changed everything. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. But it was his next words that revealed the true transformation. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. This was the moment. Not the restoration of his wealth, not the healing of his body, not even the return of his family. This was the moment when everything changed, when Job moved from second-hand faith to first-hand encounter. He had heard about God from others, teachers, tradition, testimony, but now he had seen God for himself. The difference wasn't academic, it was life-altering. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job wasn't repenting of sin, he was repenting of smallness. He wasn't confessing guilt, he was acknowledging the vast difference between the Creator and the created. The pain didn't end first, the encounter did. Job didn't get an explanation for his suffering. He got something infinitely better. He got God. And for the man who had lost everything, God was enough. More than enough. After Job spoke, the Lord said to his friends, I am angry with you, because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. The irony was stunning. The friends who had defended God's justice were condemned for their theology. The man who had questioned God's ways was commended for his honesty. Truth, it turned out, wasn't about having the right answers. It was about having the right relationship. Job was called to intercede for the very men who had wounded him with their words. And he did. The man who had lost everything became a priest for those who had added to his pain. grace flowing from the broken toward those who had tried to break him further. Then the Lord restored Job's fortunes. But notice the order. First the encounter, then the intercession, then the restoration. God didn't heal Job's circumstances until he had transformed Job's heart. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former. 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 donkeys. Double everything he had lost, except his children. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters again, but not 14 and 6, because children aren't replaceable, they're irreplaceable. But something had changed in Job that went deeper than prosperity. The man who emerged from the ashes wasn't the same man who had entered them. He had seen God, not just heard about him, believed in him, or served him, but seen him, and that sight had transformed everything. His daughters were given an inheritance among their brothers, revolutionary for that culture. The man who had encountered the God of justice became an agent of justice. The suffering had produced not bitterness, but beauty. Job lived 140 years after his trial. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation. But more than longevity, he had gained perspective. He had learned the secret that every believer must discover. God is not our means to an end. He is the end. The story doesn't end with restoration. It ends with reverence. Job's greatest gain wasn't getting his stuff back. It was seeing his Savior clearly. What if your trial isn't punishment, but permission? Permission to see God more clearly than you ever imagined. Permission to worship when worship costs everything. Permission to discover that even when you lose it all, if you have God, you have enough. If this changed how you see worship in the midst of loss, pass it on to someone facing their own whirlwind. Comment below. What would you say to God if he pointed to you and said, "Have you considered my servant?" The greatest test of faith became the greatest testimony of grace.